Russia was caught completely off guard. As the first rays of sunlight painted the Eastern European sky in shades of red, a deep, rhythmic rumble began to break the morning silence. At first, it sounded like a distant storm, but soon its true nature became clear. Dozens of massive aircraft appeared above Poland. American B-52 bombers flying in precise formations toward the east, straight toward the Russian border. For many, this sight was more than just another military maneuver. It awakened memories of a time-long thought buried, the tense years of the Cold War, when every radio signal or flicker on a radar screen might have meant the start of nuclear war. In the control centers of Kaliningrad and Minsk, dozens of signals suddenly lit up the radar displays. Russian air defense units froze for a split second before sounding the alarm. No one knew whether this was an exercise or the beginning of a real threat, but Moscow would soon receive an answer that sent a chill through its blood. To understand why this moment shook Russia so deeply, one must understand what the B-52 stands for. Designed in the 1950s, during an age of tension and constant posturing, the bomber became an enduring emblem of American might. While most aircraft from that era have long since been retired, the B-52 still flies, a living monument to endurance, engineering, and the persistence of power. These machines can travel nearly 9,000 miles without refueling, carry both conventional and nuclear weapons, and remain in the air for over 20 hours at a stretch. They don't merely cross borders, they dominate the sky above them. That morning, 80 of these colossal planes took flight, the largest formation to approach Russia in over 3 decades. For the West, it was meant as a show of readiness. For Moscow, it felt like a deliberate provocation. This was no routine patrol, it was a statement of dominance. The operation had been planned in secret. Weeks earlier, attentive observers had noticed unusual activity at air bases across Britain, Germany, and Poland. Workers pulled night shifts, convoys moved endlessly, and the air buzzed with purpose. Officially, NATO said it was preparing for strategic readiness exercises. But behind that bland phrase lay something much larger. Operation Sky Shield 2025. Shortly after midnight, the final signal came from the US-European Command. Pilots received their encrypted orders, and soon the first bombers thundered down the runways, rising one after another into the dark sky. Each aircraft disappeared into the night, heading east toward the contested frontier of Europe. Their mission was to conduct a large-scale simulated operation in complex airspace. But from Russia's perspective, it looked alarmingly real, the beginning of a new Cold War. In the air, the bombers formed 4 immense groups of 20 planes each, stretching like a metallic veil from the North Sea to central Poland. Supporting them were KC-135, tankers ensuring that the bombers would not have to land, and E-3A AWACS aircraft, monitoring every signal within NATO territory. Flying ahead of them, nearly invisible to radar, were F-35 stealth fighters tasked with scouting and surveillance. In Russian early warning centers at Königsberg and Baranovichi, tension peaked. Analysts quickly recognized the flight pattern and classified it as a potential rehearsal for a first strike. Within minutes, Russia's S-400 and S-500 missile defense systems were brought to full combat readiness. The skies along the border turned into an invisible chessboard of sensors, blips, and calculations. A battlefield of perception where every radar pulse and every intercepted message could trigger escalation. In the central command room in Moscow, red lights flashed. Officers gathered around a digital map where blue symbols crept eastward toward Russian airspace. For several minutes, panic reigned. Was this the attack they had long feared but never expected? President Vladimir Putin was immediately informed. His order was short but unmistakable. Observe, do not fire unless they fire first. Meanwhile, along the Baltic coast, MiG-31 interceptors roared into the sky, slicing through the cloud cover to take position near the bomber formations. Russian television interrupted its regular programs to announce that NATO aircraft were operating dangerously close to the country's borders. Elderly viewers could not help recalling 1962, when American bombers carrying nuclear warheads had been spotted near the Soviet frontier. For the United States, however, this flight was far more than a mere exercise. It was a message, a carefully orchestrated display of strength. Each B-52 circling over Poland embodied decades of deterrence, a signal of will and capability, peace secured through superiority. The mission aimed to prove that even in an era of drones and hypersonic weapons, the old symbol of strategic power, the heavy bomber, had lost none of its psychological force. The name Sky Shield was chosen deliberately. It evoked both defense and dominance, a shield for NATO's allies, but also a sword that marked the boundaries of power. In Moscow, the gesture was seen as an insult. For years, the Kremlin had claimed that Washington had grown too cautious to show its strength openly. Now, America proved otherwise. Alongside the American planes flew allies from across Europe, British Typhoon fighters, German Tornadoes, and Polish F-16s joined the formations at predetermined points. It was not just an American act, it was the unified voice of 31 nations declaring, "Our borders are not lines of fear, but lines of defense." Russian radar tracked every movement. By late morning, videos from Poland and the Baltic states flooded social media. Hashtags like #B-52 over Poland and NATO exercise spread rapidly. Even before the first bomb could fall, and none were ever intended to, the alliance had already achieved a psychological victory. Russia responded quickly, though not with missiles, but with imagery. The Ministry of Defense released footage of two Tu-95 bombers taking off from a base on the Kola Peninsula, escorted by Su-35 fighters. The message was obvious: Russia is not afraid. Yet military analysts noticed subtle differences. While NATO's display relied on overwhelming numbers and international coordination, Russia's countermove was smaller, defensive, almost symbolic. It seemed less like a true show of strength and more like an attempt to maintain composure. Inside the Kremlin, debates raged. Some generals urged restraint, others pushed for a counter-operation near Alaska or over the Arctic. In the end, a compromise was reached. Russia's radar systems in the Western Military District would remain on permanent high alert. A silent strategic chess match had begun. One fought not with missiles but with perception. In Washington, by contrast, officials saw the operation not as aggression but as proof of resolve. Pentagon spokespeople described the mission as a demonstration of collective defense readiness. But the reality was more nuanced. Every detail had been chosen with precision. Even the number of bombers, 80, evoked the massive Cold War flights of the past. The route was plotted so that Russian radar would clearly detect it. Visibility was part of the message. The vast movement of aircraft over the Baltic served a clear purpose. The United States wanted to show capability, not start a war, but the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Whoever could mobilize such power compelled the other side to react. And that was exactly what happened. Russia had to respond, not out of military necessity, but out of pride. On the diplomatic stage, everyone understood the implications. Within hours of the operation's start, urgent reports from Western military districts arrived in Moscow. Analysts warned that this was not merely a tactical drill, it was a psychological operation designed to remind the world that the US could react to any European threat instantly. Coordinated, disciplined, decisive. The message was unmistakable. The US controlled the tempo. Russia could only watch and respond. And in strategy, the one who reacts has already lost initiative. At the same time, the operation had another layer, a propagandistic one. Across social media, photos and videos began to circulate showing black specks gliding across the pale sky above Poland and the Baltics. Users shared them with fascination, fear, and pride. Western audiences saw a display of strength and reassurance. Many in Eastern Europe felt safer knowing that NATO's presence was not just theoretical but visible. For them, the bombers symbolized vigilance, proof that they were not alone in the face of potential aggression. Inside Russia, however, the narrative was entirely different. State television condemned the flights as deliberate, provocation, and an act of intimidation. Pundits accused NATO of psychological warfare, claiming the West wanted to corner Moscow into submission. Retired generals appeared on talk shows, warning that the United States was once again flexing its muscles and treating Eastern Europe as a stage for dominance. Yet beneath the bluster, there was a palpable sense of unease. Behind closed doors, Russian officials admitted to one another that they had underestimated the unity of NATO. For years, the Kremlin had believed that internal divisions, political disagreements, budget disputes, and contrasting national interests had weakened the alliance. But Sky Shield shattered that illusion. The sight of aircraft from over 30 countries flying in perfect coordination, communicating seamlessly and executing a shared mission was more intimidating than any missile launch. It wasn't just military strength that Russia witnessed, it was solidarity. Western newspapers described the mission as an unprecedented act of deterrence, and indeed, deterrence was its essence. The goal was never to strike, but to show that one could. This brand of power projection was as old as the Cold War itself. Back then, both sides had learned that visibility was part of defense. The more one's opponent knew about one's readiness, the less likely he was to attack. The B-52, though an aging aircraft, embodied that truth perfectly. In an age of cyber warfare and drones, it stood as a relic that still commanded fear, not because of its speed or stealth, but because of what it represented: endurance, reach, and unwavering presence. Its silhouette alone could trigger debates in military academies from Washington to Beijing. In China, defense analysts studied every detail of the operation. They examined the flight paths, the refueling patterns, and the communication methods. State media called it a masterpiece of logistical coordination. In Iran, by contrast, newspapers accused the United States of imperial arrogance, calling the flights a display of Western intimidation. Yet in Kyiv, the reaction was almost celebratory. The people of Ukraine, living under constant threat, looked up at those distant aircraft and felt hope. To them, the roaring engines in the high clouds were not a menace but a promise that the West was watching, ready to act if needed. Russia's allies, meanwhile, responded cautiously. In Minsk and Pyongyang, official statements condemned the provocative maneuvers but avoided direct threats. None wished to escalate matters with Washington. It was clear that even among its partners, Moscow's isolation was growing. Inside the cockpits of the B-52s, there was no triumphalism. The crews, 6 men per aircraft, including pilots, navigators, radar specialists, and weapons officers, went about their tasks with calm professionalism. Most were veterans of previous deployments, accustomed to long hours and cold silence. They knew their mission was psychological, not physical. At over 10,000 meters above the ground, they looked down at the snow-dusted plains of Poland and understood that Russian radars were tracking their every move. Every signal, every course correction had to be perfect. They also knew how fragile the situation was. A single misunderstanding, one misread radar ping, one misheard command, could unleash chaos. That fragile balance, that tension between readiness and restraint, was the very essence of deterrence. Peace maintained not by disarmament, but by discipline. In the Kremlin, the watching continued minute by minute. Satellite images and radar feeds streamed onto the screens of the National Command Center. Officers monitored each movement, how the bombers refueled mid-air, how they turned back west on schedule. Finally, after hours of silent tension, the symbols on the radar began to retreat. The blue dots that had seemed to creep toward Russia now moved back toward the Atlantic. No shots had been fired, no borders crossed, but the psychological shock lingered. Moscow now understood that NATO could, within hours, mount a massive, coordinated operation. Not defensive, but demonstrative. On the evening news, a spokesman for the Russian Ministry of Defense repeated the official line. Everything was under control. The country was prepared to defend itself. But behind that facade, doubt had set in. Some of Putin's advisors warned that Sky Shield should not be dismissed as a one-time stunt, but recognized as part of a larger Western strategy. Indeed, Washington's decision had not been spontaneous. U.S. intelligence had been observing increasing Russian military activity near the Baltic states and in the Arctic for weeks. Naval movements, troop transfers, and radar testing had all intensified. The deployment of the B-52s was a calculated answer, a warning wrapped in discipline. The message was clear: we can escalate too, and we can do it with control. That subtle but powerful shift unsettled Moscow. For years, Russia had used controlled provocation, buzzing NATO ships, violating airspace, conducting drills near borders, to gain leverage in diplomacy. But now the United States had turned the tactic back on them. The psychological balance had changed. If this was merely a drill, the Kremlin wondered, what would a real operation look like? The thought was unnerving. 80 bombers moving in flawless coordination without firing a shot had thrown an entire region into alert. The incident proved that modern warfare was no longer confined to the battlefield. It was waged through perception, through the manipulation of fear and spectacle. In that sense, Sky Shield 2025 was a masterpiece, a war of minds rather than machines. The global reaction reflected this duality. In Europe, most media outlets praised the mission as a demonstration of peace through preparedness. In Asia and the Middle East, the tone was far more critical. Commentators accused the United States of escalating tensions deliberately, using the exercise to constrain the ambitions of Russia and China. Yet no one denied the operation's success in reshaping the strategic landscape. In the days that followed, the skies over Eastern Europe returned to quiet, but diplomatic hotlines were ablaze. Military attachés exchanged official notes, ministries issued cautious statements, and think tanks began dissecting the mission's implications. Everyone agreed on one thing: Sky Shield had changed the rules. It had shown that power could be felt without being fired, that dominance could be demonstrated through motion alone. As the bomber groups turned westward, Europe exhaled in collective relief. Morning light broke over calm skies, but the political atmosphere had shifted. Behind the scenes, analysts scrambled to measure the impact. Had the mission strengthened deterrence, or had it risked pushing Moscow toward greater hostility? In NATO's headquarters in Brussels, the mood was almost jubilant. The exercise had gone flawlessly, coordinated, disciplined, incident-free. Not a single aircraft had strayed off course. No violation of airspace had occurred. No warning shots had been fired. For military planners, it was a triumph. Proof that the alliance could execute one of the largest air operations in decades with precision and control. In Washington, officials publicly described the flight as a pure defensive exercise, but privately they acknowledged its real nature. a calculated show of strength, a direct response to Russian muscle flexing in the Baltic and the Arctic. The unspoken message was simple: every move you make will have a visible counter. That message had landed exactly as intended. In Moscow, official rhetoric remained cold and composed, but inside the defense establishment, anxiety simmered. Intelligence reports indicated that parts of Russia's command structure had gone into high alert within hours of the bombers appearing on radar. For the US, that was victory enough. Russia had been forced to react, to shift resources, to expose procedures, all without a single missile launched. The episode underscored a truth about modern power. Strength in the 21st century is built on perception. The B-52, a plane that first flew more than 70 years ago, had proven once again that deterrence lies not in innovation but in persistence. Its enduring frame and unmistakable silhouette reminded the world that some symbols never fade. In Moscow's defense circles, the term psychological warfare was soon on everyone's lips. Yet that phrase captured exactly what the mission had been designed to achieve. Sky Shield had succeeded not through destruction, but through perception. The bombers spoke in silence. They needed no words, no radio transmissions. Their mere presence, steady, visible, unstoppable, carried its own message. In the days that followed, the debate intensified. Russian commentators accused the West of endangering global peace, while Western leaders countered that they had only demonstrated their readiness to defend. Between those two narratives lay the complicated truth. Sky Shield was both a warning and a reassurance, a performance of restraint wrapped in power. Within NATO, military analysts celebrated the operation as a milestone. Coordination between nations had worked flawlessly. British Typhoons, German Tornadoes, Polish F-16s, and American B-52s flying as a single, synchronized force. Communications held steady across all frequencies. Refueling operations were executed to perfection. At a time when skeptics questioned the alliance's cohesion, Sky Shield had proven otherwise. It was a living demonstration that collective defense was more than a treaty. It was an operational reality. Across Europe, commentators called it a new chapter in deterrence. Photographs of the massive bombers gliding through morning clouds filled front pages. To many, they were symbols of resolve, reminders that freedom, though fragile, still had guardians. Meanwhile, Russia tried to reclaim the narrative. State television broadcast its own footage. Two aging Tu-95 bombers escorted by Su-35 fighters over the Arctic. Yet the contrast was striking. The Russian footage felt defensive, nostalgic, almost ceremonial, while NATO's operation had exuded precision, technology, and unity. Even Russian viewers noticed the difference. On social media, both sides turned the skies into symbols. Western users wrote of unity and peace through strength, while Russian voices warned of provocation and escalation. But no matter the viewpoint, everyone felt the tension. Even ordinary citizens sensed that Sky Shield had not been just a drill. It had been a message written across the sky. Inside one B-52 cockpit, a pilot watched the horizon brighten above the Baltic Sea. The engines had been roaring for nearly 20 hours. His hands rested calmly on the controls as the navigator beside him adjusted coordinates in silence. Every crew member knew that their flight was shaping history, not through destruction, but through restraint. Each movement had to be exact, each silence deliberate. They were flying inside a fragile balance between dominance and diplomacy, between intimidation and control. When the formation finally crossed back into British and German airspace, the operation ended as quietly as it had begun. There was no cheering, no fanfare, only the fading sound of engines and the blinking confirmation on the monitors. Mission complete. For Russia, the real work began afterward, interpreting what it all meant. Analysts gathered in windowless rooms, replaying satellite footage, studying radar signatures, and arguing about intent. Some insisted that Sky Shield was simply an exercise meant to reassure NATO's eastern members. Others saw it as a test of Russia's reaction, the time a deliberate probe to measure its readiness. But the conclusion many reached was more unsettling. The West had turned its borders into a theater of communication. Every maneuver, every flight path, every formation was now a language, and Sky Shield had spoken fluently. In Western capitals, satisfaction mixed with caution. The mission had proved that NATO could still act decisively and in unison. Yet it also highlighted how thin the line between deterrence and escalation had become. Power had been projected without violence, but even symbols can spark fear. The same images that reassured some had alarmed others. Still, within the alliance, confidence surged. The exercise had shown that decades of coordination, training, and shared doctrine could still produce flawless execution. This is what unity looks like, one senior NATO commander told reporters, not in words, but in flight. In Moscow, officials faced a dilemma. To retaliate openly would risk confrontation. To remain silent would appear weak. The compromise was subtle. Smaller-scale air drills over the Barents Sea and the Far East, highly visible but carefully controlled. A counter symbol rather than a counter strike. The great game of gestures continued, quieter now, but constant. Sky Shield had set a rhythm, and both sides followed it. In Washington, senior officials briefed the president and defense secretary. There were no losses, no incidents, no diplomatic fallout, and yet the desired effect had been achieved. Russia was uneasy, Europe reassured. For policymakers, it was the textbook definition of success. In Kyiv, the operation was interpreted in emotional terms. A government spokesman said that seeing the bombers overhead felt like standing under a shield of steel. In a nation living with war, such symbolism meant everything. For them, Sky Shield wasn't just strategy, it was hope made visible. For days, the world's newspapers continued to analyze the event. Some described it as a shadow over Europe, others as the dawn of a new age of controlled strength. Military experts predicted that Sky Shield would be studied for years as a model of modern deterrence, a case where visibility itself became a weapon. Russian commentators, in turn, warned that the West was playing with fire, but their tone lacked conviction, as if the outrage were meant more for show than for belief. Looking back, it was clear that the mission had left no physical trace, yet its echo lingered. It had not changed borders, but it had redrawn perceptions. The skies had become a screen on which nations projected their fears and ambitions. And the lesson was paradoxical. The greatest weapons were not missiles, but movements, deliberate, disciplined, and unmistakable. In the weeks that followed, calm returned, at least on the surface, but everyone knew that the calm was fragile. Russia now understood that NATO could reveal its strength at any moment, and NATO knew that it could prove its unity when tested. When the B-52s finally landed on their home bases, the crews climbed down from their aircraft, exhausted but proud. The engines cooled, the hangars fell silent, and for a brief instant, peace seemed to settle again over Europe. But the planners and analysts watching from command centers knew better. Peace, they realized, now depended not on treaties or borders, but on constant readiness, on the will to act without attacking. Somewhere in the dim light of a control room, screens still glowed. Satellites tracked, radars pulsed, and data streamed endlessly across continents. The world had entered a new age of vigilance, where even silence was strategic, because deterrence, after all, never sleeps. And as long as the shadows of history linger over Europe, the sky, vast, restless, and watchful, will never be completely still.